Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. We're having a CENELEC webinar this afternoon about the amendments and common modifications. Should you be interested in the CEN webinar of this morning, we recorded it, so it's already available on the CEN expert sites. My name is Elsa, and I'll be moderating the webinar in the background. As usual, you are all muted during the presentation, so you cannot raise your question, but you can use the Q&A panel to submit your questions should you have a question. The speakers will have a look at your questions and reply as many questions as possible. Should it not be replied, we intend to make a Q&A report available. Please also note that the webinar has been recorded, so we will share with you the recording and the presentation afterwards. Should you be on Twitter or X, as we call it today, you are free, of course, to speak about the topic with the hashtag training for standards, and you can find CEN and CENELEC with the handle @standards4EU. So I have the pleasure to give the floor to my colleagues Amy and Marlies, who are going through the common modifications and the amendments for CENELEC. Please, ladies, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Els. So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, where we are going to cover two very important topics, amendments and common modifications, or as we'll refer to them throughout today's webinar, common mods, because it's a little bit easier. So the first half of this webinar will be with me, with Amy, and we're going to cover amendments. So we'll talk about what is an amendment, how should one be drafted, and then afterwards, the second half will be common modifications with Marlies, where she will talk about what is a common mod and how one should be drafted. So nice and simple. And then at the very end, we'll give you just a final reminder of resources that you can take with you for the future to help you with drafting if you are horribly stuck where to go. So let's get started with amendments. So what is an amendment? So an amendment is basically a set of modifications to an already published text. So this is only applicable for ENs. So we can't have an amendment to a technical specification, so a TS, or a technical report, a TR. We only ever allow amendments to ENs. That's worth noting first. And these follow the same track as a regular EN as well. So at inquiry stage, they go through the 12-week voting process. Formal vote, they go through the 8-week voting process. And the publication is obviously the same on a Friday. The procedure is exactly the same with the TC proofing, the translation, all of that. So it really is the same track. It's just a bit different how we draft it. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And as well, it follows IR3. As per a regular EN, TS, TR, you follow the IR3 rules, so the Internal Regulations Part 3. We recommend that you familiarize yourself with the big deep dive webinar that we did earlier this year on IR3 to give you all the rules and how to apply them as well, just so that you know what you need to do, because that is something that the editors check. So what we have is a simple template for amendments. So for those of you who've been following this webinar series, you should be familiar with the simple template for a regular EN, a TS, or a TR. Well, we've created the same thing for an amendment to make the drafting of an amendment super simple for you. That is currently undergoing a review procedure. We're just making sure that it's as perfect as it can be before we put that on the CENELEC boss. Once it's up there, we will let you know. And we're also working on a CEN-Boss page. So once those are live and updated, we can always inform you, whether that will be in the form of a webinar or simply an email. We haven't decided yet, but please do keep an eye out for that. But for now, you can just use the regular simple template. It will do the same thing. You're just going to follow the guidance that we give you today, very simply. So it goes without saying, make sure to only modify the parts which need to be modified. It seems a bit silly to say that, but we do see a lot of people modifying massive amounts of text that just don't need to be modified. So for example, if you modify just one word in a paragraph, you don't need to replace the whole clause or the whole subclause. You can just replace that single word and give us the whole paragraph as an example. Or for example, if you modify one cell in a table, you don't need to replace the whole table. You can just tell us where that cell is, what needs to be replaced in there, and we can do that. Just keep it simple, basically. And as I've already said, IR3 does apply. So when you send your text to us and it's allocated to the editor, we still go through, we check everything, and we apply the rules in IR3 as well. So we're checking the notes to make sure there are no requirements in there, recommendations or permissions. We're checking your use of shall versus must. All of the regular things that we check in an EN, we check in an amendment as well. So now on to some drafting guidance. The main thing to take away from this is to keep it simple. Draft it as simply as you can. And to help you with this, we have some specific wording that we recommend that you use. So first of all, we have add. Very simply, if you're adding new content to existing content, so you're adding a new paragraph, a new figure, a new clause, anything like that, just simply add the following new sentence, new whatever, as follows. The same thing with delete. If you're removing content from an existing from existing content, you're just going to do delete. So delete the following phrase, delete the following reference. It just means that you don't intend to put anything back once it's gone. You're just deleting it straight away. And then replacing. So replace you use if you're modifying content which already exists. So you don't want to delete it completely and you're not adding something in there as well. You're replacing it. So replace the following reference with the updated reference or something like that. But keep it simple. If you stick to these three, you can't go wrong. And clauses also have specific titles as well. So we have, for example, modification to clause 6, and then you're going to cite the title after that as well. And the same thing here, addition of a new Annex A, and then you give the title of the annex. And it's easy peasy, lemon squeezy. If you stick to this, you can't go wrong. Super simple. Everybody's happy. The translators are happy. They know what they're doing with this wording. Members are happy. They know what they need to do. Editors are happy as well because it's clear for everybody what needs to happen. So what does this look like in principle? Because the theory's kind of complicated sometimes. So for example, in clause 7.2, add the following new sentence, and then you'll give the following sentence as well. So whatever you want to change in clause 7.2, I'm going to add it. You're going to then give the sentence afterwards. Or in clause 2, delete the following references, and then you tell us which references we need to delete afterwards. And in clause 3, in term 3.5, because we need to be specific about which term we're actually going to replace something in or modify in some way. So we're just replacing the definition with the following, and then you give the new definition as well. But what about for figures and tables? What happens then? Well, in tables, we need to be a bit more specific about where we are, because obviously tables have a lot of columns, a lot of rows. It can get a bit confusing. So very simply, in table 6, we count 4 rows down and 3 columns across. And in there, we want to add, replace, or delete something. So we're using the same wording, those 3 verbs, add, delete, replace, and you're being very specific about where we need to go. And for figures, add the following new figure 3. But let's imagine that you have 7 or 8 figures in there and you want to add something new. Well, obviously, the ones after that need to be renumbered. So what we don't want you to do is go into each clause where there is a figure title that needs to be renumbered or a figure citation that needs to be renumbered. We just ask that you add the new following figure 3 in this case, and then renumber the remaining figures throughout. It's nice and simple. We know we need to renumber all the figures throughout. The users need to know that they need to renumber the figures throughout as well, but it keeps the length of the amendment text down, keeps it nice and short, and it's simple and concise. And very simply, we want to delete table A2. So you can see some good examples there of just how to lay things out. But what this means is that clauses 1, 2, and 3 are not the scope, normative references, and terms and definitions, which is the case in a regular EN. We have those as obligatory, being clause 1, 2, and 3, scope, normative references, and terms and definitions. In this case, if you're not modifying any of these clauses, you just start with clause 1 as the first clause that you're modifying, even if that's clause 6, clause A2, whatever it is. Obviously, if you're modifying the scope, normative references, and terms and definitions, those are going to be clauses 1, 2, and 3, or whatever. But we don't stick to the same structure as a regular EN in that regard. The only obligatory clause is the European forward, and you can use the same template for that as for the inquiry. So what's written in the inquiry simple template at the moment, you can just use that, because the only difference really is the reference number, which we'll talk about shortly. So now what should you include in an amendment? Because it can be quite confusing, like what constitutes a technical change and what constitutes an editorial change. So you have to absolutely include technical changes. What do we mean by this? So anything that adds, deletes, or modifies requirements or other technical content. So anything that changes the meaning of the technical content, we need to mark that as a change in our amendment text. Similarly, if you're modifying any tables, figures, formulae, anything like that, if you're adding or deleting annexes, if you're adding or deleting clauses, modifying them in any way, that kind of thing, then you need to mark that in the instructions very simply. So what shouldn't I include then, if that's what I have to include? Well, any minor editorial changes don't need to be noted down. So by this, we mean any kind of alignment to introductory wording in IR3. So if you are modifying something that used the old IR3 and you want us to update the introductory wording in clause 2 or in clause 3, we don't need to note that down as a change that needs to be tagged in any way. Similarly, this European standard becoming this document, we don't need to tag that because that can be everywhere throughout the text and it can get quite messy if we constantly have to say in all of these clauses modify this European standard to this document. It's a bit crazy. And similarly, finally, grammar and punctuation. We don't need to tag every single instance where you fix the grammar, the punctuation, maybe some spelling or something like that. But if you do see any kind of change like this, you can inform your editor and we can consider if we need to make those changes in the original publication. So we can take it into account, we can look at it on a case-by-case basis and just see if it's something that we need to take into account. So then on to the final publication. So the text of the amendment, the inquiry of the formal vote text, what's been voted on, becomes the official publication. So the reference that you see on screen, so EN 1234 part 5, we give the date, and then either PRA1 for an inquiry or FPRA1 for a formal vote. That will become the publication, which becomes EN 1234 part 5 and A1 with a slash, because it's a standalone amendment, but it is the official publication. And then informally, CCMC will prepare a consolidation for information only. So just to show how those changes need to be incorporated into the original standard for information purposes only. The official publication is that amendment text that was voted on. Worth taking that into account. So now some timeframes for publication. As usual, you get the TC proofing, which is 2 weeks. And during that 2 weeks, as usual, we expect that you respond to the comments and check the consolidation as well, just to make sure that everything's been done properly. Obviously worth noting that no technical changes can be brought to this text at this stage. So make sure that you read the formal vote and inquiry very, very carefully. The translation is 4 weeks. And the publication is our DAV, and that is always on a Friday, the CENELEC. Nice and simple. Amendments should be easy enough to follow.
But now, common modifications, maybe less easy to follow, I don't know, we'll see. Hi, everyone. So let's talk common modifications. First, I have some basics for you. What is a common modification? Common modifications contain modifications to the content of an IEC standard. So in contrast with what Amy was talking about, we're not talking about modifications to a CENELEC homegrown, but to an IEC standard. How do we draft common modifications? Basically, the structure, the template, all those drafting rules that Amy just talked about, they also apply to common modifications. And then I am not going to talk about the process for common mods today. You can check CENELEC BOSS if you find the information you need there. There was also a very important webinar. The links are there in the slides. And if you have questions about the process, for example, how to create a work item for common modifications, please contact your technical project manager. They will know best. Of course, if you have questions about drafting, you can ask us, the editors. Very important to know is that common modifications are always a separate work item. They are drafted and published as European amendment, which exists next to your ENIC parallel document or adoption, which we call the main. There's a little example here for you. So imagine at IEC, this standard was published in 2020, and at CENELEC, we adopted this IEC standard. The ENIC you see there on the left, which is the main. And then to this main, an A11 and an A12, so common modifications, were also published. Now, a little bit about the naming. Common modifications are not named A1, A2, but /A11, A12, etc. As opposed to amendments to standards of CENELEC origin, which are the A1s, A2s. Why do we do this? To ensure that IEC-based amendments have the same number in both IEC and CENELEC. A little example there again. So at IEC, the 2020 standard was published. We adopted the ENIC. Common modifications were published at CENELEC, which were named A11. Then in 2024, on the right, you see IEC published A1. And then at CENELEC side, we adopted this A1, which of course is called the A1, not A11. And that way there is a distinction between the A1 and the A11. Now, at inquiry stage and at formal vote stage, we will not use A11, A12, etc., but we will use AA and AB, depending on the stage. At inquiry, it will be PR. At formal vote, it will be FPR. So a 2B, A11 will be AA, and a 2B, A12 will be AB, etc. And then one additional remark. It is possible that a main or common mods does not have ENIC in the reference, but EN instead. This can happen when the main was published before 2018. And because the referencing of the common mods will follow the referencing or naming of the main, it could be that your common mods will be named EN 6000, etc., instead of ENIC 6000, etc. Now, let's dive into the actual content of these documents. The body of the common modifications will be a list of modifications to the content of an IEC standard. For example, you see here a subclass D13 in an IEC standard. And if by common modifications this subclass needs to be modified, this is what your common modifications could look like. Now, what are the different elements in the main and the common modifications, and who prepares what? By different elements, I mean forward, title page, annexes, etc. I'm going to break this down into 3 scenarios because it makes a difference. The first scenario is when the main and the common modifications are published at the same time. This applies for both harmonized and non-harmonized. Second scenario is when your common modifications are published after the main was published for non-harmonized standards. And then scenario 2B is the same. So common modifications are published after the main was published, but for harmonized standards. So first scenario. Your main and your common modifications are being published at the same time. Your ENIC parallel document or adoption, so your main, will contain a title page, a forward. This forward will have the template for ENIC parallel documents or adoptions. And this will all be prepared by the editor at publication stage. And we will, of course, then send it to you for TC proofing, where you are expected to check if everything is correct. Your common modifications will also contain, of course, a title page and a forward. The template for the forward here will be the one for homegrown CENELEC documents. Then there will be a list of modifications to the IEC standard text, and then modifications to Annex ZA, or just an Annex ZA, and possibly an Annex ZZ if you're dealing with a harmonized document. Why do I put there modifications to between brackets? Because imagine you could be working on an A12 and the A11 already exists and has a Annex ZA in there. So then in your A12, you might just want to modify the Annex ZA instead of adding it. These common modifications are prepared by the drafters, and they go through the inquiry and formal vote process. And an example here, just to point out that here you see a main being published in October 2020, and the common mods were published at the same time. For example, they might modify Annex L, as you see there on the left, and this one added in Annex Z. Now, the second scenario, where the common modifications are published only after the main was published. And first, I'm going to talk about non-harmonized documents. In this case, your main will have, again, a title page, a forward, and an Annex ZA. All of this being prepared by the editor at publication stage and again sent to you for TC proofing. Then the common mods will have a title page, a forward, again a list of modifications, and then possible modifications to the Annex ZA, because of course your main already has an Annex ZA and you might want to modify that in the common modifications. This again is prepared by the drafters and goes through inquiry and formal vote. Then the last scenario, same scenario, but for harmonized documents. So your common modifications are being published after the main was published. Your main will contain a title page, a forward, which will be prepared by the editor at publication stage. And then the Annex ZA and Annex ZZ will be prepared by the drafters. Why? Because these annexes need to be sent for HAS assessment. And then the editor will add these at publication stage to the document. Your common mods will have a title page, a forward, again a list of modifications, and then possible modifications to Annex ZA and Annex ZZ, or an addition of the Annex ZZ. Now, why on the left side did I put and Annex ZZ between brackets, and on the right side I put or addition of Annex ZZ? Because you could have a situation where your main is published as a non-harmonized document, and then through the common mods, you harmonize the document by adding an Annex ZZ. And again, to visualize this, you see here a main that was published in September 2020. It contained a Annex ZA, and then in the common modifications, which were published 4 years later, the Annex ZA is being replaced, and here you see annexes ZZA and ZZB being added, so making the document harmonized. Now, a very important last topic. it's important to know that all of these related documents shall be read together. So, for example, you have your text of your IEC standard, then the ENIC to that. You have an A11, you can have maybe an A1, maybe an A2, and then an A12, and all of these need to be read together. Again, to visualize this, so you have your IEC standard published in 2020. CENELEC adopts this standard also in 2020, so you have your main. Then at CENELEC, an A11 is created. In 2024, at IEC, an Amendment 1 is published. At CENELEC, we adopt this A1 in 2024 also. And then on top of that, an A12 is created. And all of these have to be read together. You could consider it a little bit like a puzzle that needs to be put together, which can sometimes be a bit complicated, but for us as well, that's just the way it is. And then one final point I want to make is that, and so based on what I just said, an A12 does not supersede an A11. So if you publish an A12, that does not mean that A11 disappears or is superseded or goes away. You have to use your A12 on top of the A11. So for example, here, an A11 had added this subclass. As you can see, add the following new subclass. And then the A12 builds on what was already in that A11, and it replaces that existing subclass. And then I give Amy the last word.
Yes, so I'm thinking just before we go into the final information and resources, because we still have some time left, I'd just very quickly like to take you through the simple template, just to show you, now that you have some background on the amendment drafting and also the common modification drafting, how you can use the simple template for amendments to put all of that together. So we already have this open and ready to go. So if I go all the way up to the top, this is what we have prepared for you. So as I said in the beginning, when this goes live on the CENELEC BOSS, this is what you will have access to, exactly like the simple template, just modified really for amendments to make it as easy as possible for you to draft and style everything correctly. So as you can see, this is simply just a downloadable Word document, just like this, the simple template as well. So obviously, as you're modifying an already existing deliverable, so an EN or an IEC text, anything like that, you can already pop the reference in. So let's do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're going to put our year in. Let's keep it X for now, because we don't know when this was originally published. And we maybe have an AA, or we can have our A1, whichever we need. So you can see it's very simple just to type directly into with whatever information we need to include. Obviously, you can pop your title in. It's simply just a case of deleting what we don't need, typing it in, and we go through. So the table of contents, as you can see, it's set up just to have those modification to clause, blah, blah. We're adding annexes. It's really a comprehensive guide as well for you to draft up a common modification or an amendment. As you can see, the simple template, the template for the European forward is in here as well. So you've just copy and pasted it in. This is still a work in progress. We are still in the process of quality checking this to make sure it's as perfect as it can be. But the principle will be exactly the same. Anything where you see it's red, you modify, you delete whatever you don't need. So if you don't have a harmonized document, we can just delete this. And you can see it is gone, as are our page numbers along the side. So we won't go too much into detail with this, but just so that you are aware, it is there and it will be coming for you and you can use it. So we have modify, replace, add, delete, our verbs. It's very, very useful. So once this has been published on the CENELEC BOSS, we will inform you whether that will be via email or a mini webinar. We don't know yet, but Yeah, we will let you know when this is up. So you can see modifications to formulae, to tables, with some notes to the drafters as well, so that you know exactly what you're doing with this. Modification to annexes, how to put all of this in, and it is all the same styles as well. So if we open up our style palette, we can see that we've got all of the styles that are in the simple template. So we can see there we've got our lists, list numbers, intro title, headings, everything is exactly the same. So keep an eye out for that, but for the time being, if you're drafting right now, you can just use the regular simple template. So going back to our final information and resources, so what we're going to leave you with today. So if you are thinking, help, I watched the webinar, but amendments and common mods are still confusing me, which is entirely possible, you can get in touch with us directly. Also, if you're not sure if you've done something correctly, if you're not sure if you've drafted something correctly, that kind of thing, you can always get in touch and we can help you. So any kind of question, comment, if you don't have an editor, contact production at cenelec.eu and our lovely production colleagues will connect you with an editor who can help. If, however, you already have an editor's contact details, for example, from today, you have my contact and you have Marlies' contact as well, you can contact us directly. You also have the name of the editor on projects online too. If you have any questions about today's webinar specifically, or something we didn't cover, or something we didn't cover too well, maybe you're still confused, anything like that, you can always contact myself or Marlies directly, and we will try to help you as best we can, or clarify, or just cover it in a future webinar as well. But that is it from us today. It was a bit of a heavy topic. Hopefully we were able to shed some light on it. Else, do you want to explain the poll?
Yes, we had a few questions coming in already, but Gonzalo answered most of them. So before going on with the questions, I would like to ask the audience to reply to the feedback poll. So it's 3 short questions that we ask you to fill in. We use the replies to improve our webinars in the future. So thank you very much in advance for replying those questions. As promised, we will provide all attendees with the presentation and the recording of today's webinar. So please bear with me. I will send it still today. So you can have a look back and eventually share it also with some colleagues if it should be of interest.
So yeah, I think there is a question from Danilo Kreiner. And if you understand well the question, the point is if we have an A11 and A12 and in between IEC is publishing an A1, if we need to publish an A13. Not necessarily. We only need to publish an A13 if you want to introduce modifications to the IEC text. If the missing elements are just Annex Z and Annex ZA, those are not considered common modifications, so they don't necessarily need to be brought through an A13 in this case. So they can be put together with the A1 on the IC side. So we launch the procedures for the A1 on the CENELEC side, and the European elements can be included to the A1. So there is a question that is about if there is no need to add comments, why change an amendment or a comment modification? So if it's necessary to change, may not be plausible for everybody. So what has been presented is just in the case that the comment modification is necessary. So if no changes are needed, so basically we follow the parallel process in line with the Frankfurt Agreement. And whenever IEC is having a CDV, we have an inquiry on the CENELEC side, and that at the formal vote, the same. When IEC starts the FTs, we start the formal vote. So there is no need to introduce modifications at the CENELEC side. They are only introduced when there is a need from the technical side. The last question we have at the moment is also a follow-up of some of the questions already answered during the webinar. So this is essentially linked to the process for the preparation of common modifications. So this information is included in BOSS. This process has been discussed with the permanent delegate technical board, and it was foreseen to basically develop European standards in a simpler and in a faster way, also in line with the parallel developments at IEC. So this process foresees at different stages, different actions, depending on the stage of the document. It can imply that in some cases the A11 brings some additional time to be finalized, but that's the process that we have at the moment, and we need to work upon this process. So we do recommend everyone to look in the CENELEC BOSS. There is a specific page on the preparation of common modifications on the necessary steps to be taken, and there are some flow charts explaining the different steps. So we do recommend people to look into this information in the CENELEC BOSS.
Okay, that was the last question in the list. Thank you, Gonzalo. Thank you, Marlies and Amy as well for the interesting webinar. Thank you also for all attendees to reply the feedback poll. That's much appreciated. If we can go maybe to the last slide, I think there is on the last slide a small list of upcoming webinars. Yes, of course, you used the Q&A panel already. The upcoming list of webinars is linked on this last slide. So as promised, I will share with you this presentation, and should you be interested to follow these webinars, you are free to register. So thank you very much, and hopefully see you next time. Bye-bye.